welcome. My name is Justin Field. I'm a cross architecture BDM here at Cisco. Joining me is
Hey folks, Dave Abbott. I'm a solutions architect here at Cisco, focused on SASE and Zero Trust.
and this is our podcast, Cybersecurity. So, Dave, welcome. First podcast we have, and I want to start off with an understanding of what you're drinking.
Yeah, well, we got to be sipping something, all right? And so, going to be bringing out different bottles for each one of these. Try a couple different ones. We'll see how the evening takes us with each one. But my first go-to on the inaugural Open is going to be Blue Run here. Now, it's 111 proof, so I got to be a little careful with how much I'm pouring myself. But this is some good stuff. It's the high rye. There's a lot of spice on it. They talk about 65% corn, 30% rye, and then 5% malted barley. The parent company is Bardstown, and they do a fantastic job with their bourbons. So, yeah, I've been enjoying this one. My wife and I opened it as a celebration to her getting a new job. So it's a happy bottle to get started with.
That is fantastic. Now, you mentioned spicy. Like, do you prefer a spicier bourbon or whiskey versus not? Like, what's your preference?
Yeah, I think for me, I love a lot of flavor on it. I'm all good with a smooth bourbon, something lower proof, like an 80 proof. But at the end of the day, I like something that's got a little kick on it, that's going to really give me some burn. I like that personally. But the thing is, you got to drink it right. And when you've got high proof and high rye, you're going to have a ton of flavor. My brother-in-law says it's like you're breathing fire. You should be feeling it as you're taking that first couple breaths after a sip.
Right. And so now I love a good bourbon or whiskey, but I would still state that I am newer, right, as a bourbon and whiskey drinker, right? So again, growing up, the older you get, I feel like you start getting into bourbons and whiskeys. And I know, Dave, you and I have had recent conversations about the process and everything that goes into it and the different flavors and tones and whatnot. And again, we talk about the burn. Um, can you help me understand, like, is it the aging that makes it burn more or that gives you more of that flavor? Like, what is it? Like, help educate me on that
Yeah,
process.
a lot of it has to do with the mash bill, right? So what are they making it out of, right? The first initial distilling process. But a lot of the flavor also comes from the type of wood they use in their barrels, where they store it. So Kentucky is a very popular place because you get all four seasons. So they'll put it in a warehouse for storage, and in the summertime, and it'll get to 120 degrees in there, right? And so you've got this expansion and contraction in the wood as you hit the winter months, and that's what gives it its color, a lot of flavoring, and ultimately, the longer it sits in that barrel, usually the more flavor you get. Now, what also can happen is over the years, some will evaporate, and so you might fill that barrel full, but after 10 years, you only have about 60% left.
Oh,
When you
wow.
take it out, you had put it in at 80, 90 proof, but when you take it out after that evaporation, you might be at 130, 140 proof. And that's what they call as barrel proof, right? The really high stuff. And then many times they'll add water to it to help smooth it out some. But those bourbon connoisseurs, they love having the barrel proof stuff. They'll have it at 125, 130 proof.
Yeah.
I mean, it's pretty hot on the tongue, but
Yeah.
I love it. You get the best flavors out of it that way.
Yeah. And you mentioned, what was the proof? What are you drinking?
This is 111, so certainly not the highest I've had, but it's up there.
Gotcha. And I'm looking at mine. So, Dave, for our inaugural podcast, I chose 5280's Cackler's Whiskey, and it's one of my favorites. It's a local distillery, literally like walking distance, which is fantastic, right? Walking distance from my home. It's 43% alcohol, so 86 proof. And I looked at yours, and the color was like a bit darker, and
Yeah,
like mine's a little bit on the lighter side.
right.
And I love the bottle. I love everything on that
But you got the
front.
mountains and stuff.
I
Right?
got the
That's
mountains on
heavy
it.
for you.
Sorry,
Yeah.
5280, right? I got a bottle coming your way, so I hope you enjoy it. But I think that, just for it being local, I like to represent, and obviously when there's some great places across the country that I want to try that local brand, of bourbon. Now, again, bourbon and whiskey. Now, this says a blend of rye bourbon whiskey. So the only thing that can have bourbon in its name is if it's produced in the USA. Is that correct?
So, uh, yes and no. So typically, bourbon comes out of Kentucky. In fact, that they've sort of released that restriction. It used to be it had to be out of Kentucky to be a bourbon. Nowadays, they say it has to be made with at least 51% corn, and there's some pretty strict rules around that. So, a bourbon is a type of whiskey. Not all whiskey is bourbon, right? Think of the whole square and rectangle type
Gotcha.
thing.
Yeah.
So yeah, they've got fairly strict rules around bourbon, but nowadays it doesn't have to be out of Kentucky, but it does have to be at least 51% corn.
Gotcha. That makes sense. Right. I love that analogy, right? A square can be a rectangle, but a rectangle doesn't necessarily mean it's a square.
You got it. Same thing with bourbon and whiskey.
Gotcha. Yeah, I'm learning. And then again, in one of these episodes, Dave, I would love to talk about ice and the different types of ice. I know, we were at an event, the square ice, like the clear, the clarity, like that's an art in itself, right?
Now, there's something to be said. We're on Cybersecurity, so we can talk about clear ice in terms of what goes in your drink, and then we go to Identity Services Engine.
There you go.
And talk about that ice,
talk
right?
about that too.
Hosted in the cloud. You got Azure support now.
Yeah.
We could go all into this.
We could talk. We could save that for another day. But I know we had the conversation at a conference, and there was square ice. We talked about the clarity, the different methodologies, the type of water that you use. But again, I think I found the secret, but we'll talk about that in another session.
All right, fair enough.
So, cheers to you, right?
Hey. Oh, you're over ice too. Hey.
Yeah, I'm over ice. Yeah. So and maybe this is just me, and actually that was going to be one of my questions for you, Dave. Is like, do you prefer ice or not? Like, I like to have cold. I like to drink. I like my drinks to be cold. I'm not a warm drink person.
Yeah. For me, if it's going to be a higher proof one that I'm looking for a lot of flavor, I'll drink it straight because that's where you get the most flavor. Now, most people will say you want to add just a little bit of water to open it up. But if you add a bunch of ice, you're likely going to dilute it and you're going to numb out some of the flavor you can get. So proper tasting, you don't want to have ice. However, if you're just doing a leisurely drink it how you want, right? That's what it's all about at the end of the day. So don't need to be a stickler for the rules.
Gotcha. So higher proof, more flavor, less ice is what you're saying.
I mean, it'll also get you feeling good pretty soon. I got to be careful on this podcast by the end of it.
Exactly. That's why we do this later in the day, right?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, it's secretly 9 a.m. right now, right?
Exactly. Right. Yeah, don't tell our boss, that it's 9 a.m. in the morning. No, that's fantastic. Well, fantastic. Okay, so part of the construct of this, and we want to talk about bourbon, we want to talk about whiskey, but the second half is talking about security. And there's so much security going on in the world, right? You have a specialty in security with Zero Trust and SASE, right? I focus on hybrid work. There's components of SASE within that, and then being able to talk on the sales front on Zero Trust. So I think it makes sense for both of us to embark on this journey together, and make it conversational. And I think that's what, honestly, when you and I do our WebEx meetings and it's you and I, and there might be 100 people around, we came up with the concept of like, let's do a podcast and let's just do the same format. And that's all it is. It's just, imagine it's just you and I having a conversation, sipping on bourbon or whiskey. And
we can go a little more off the rails than we typically do too.
I think you could, yeah. Yeah, it might be frowned upon, with some of the.
You can always edit it after if it's too bad, right?
Exactly. So a couple things, like, and when you and I, we talk security all the time. I recently did an event out in Washington, customer focused event talking about security, security summit. You and I are going to be traveling a lot, right, in FY23 at security summits. And in the last session I did, I brought up news articles, and I talked about my routine and being able to educate, like, what's going on in this world, as it relates to security. And Dave, there was an article that came out regarding LA school district, right? It's the second largest school district in the country. And they almost didn't open because of a potential threat in their environment, right? Ransomware, something along the lines, compromised files, dark web, all this other stuff. That's that's an up and coming, like ransomware is a huge threat in
Yeah.
itself. But when you start targeting school districts, like what's your take on that?
Well, what's especially interesting about that. So even though the attack wasn't necessarily successful, they did report that they're seeing an increased activity in malicious threats, and most of them were blocked. Now, they noted that some credentials, username, password, and email were found on the dark web, but there's actually a group that claimed credit for this attack, even though they didn't successfully pull it off, which is a bit unique. Usually, you'd hear about these groups claiming credit or extorting for money after the fact once they've been successfully able to implement ransomware. But what's interesting about this group, Vice Group or Vice Society, is that they're a double extortion group, and what that really means is not only did they come in and encrypt your data and demand money, ransom, to get your data back, they'll also exfiltrate that data and sell it to the highest bidder and or just publish it to the dark web. Um, that's a major threat. And what's actually really interesting about it, there's some psychological studies of whether bad actors want to do that or not. If you have too many times that ransomware hits and you pay that ransom and they don't give you your data back, or it's already been exfiltrated and sold to the dark web, you have no incentive to pay that ransom. You might as well consider it gone, right?
Sure.
And so there's this dichotomy going on of, do I give back the data or decrypt it once they pay the ransom or not? And there's about a 50% hit rate going on right now of whether that happens. Now, if that continues to go down and the data is still exfiltrated and you still pay ransom, at that point you might as well just not pay it. So there's this interesting growth happening, and I think bad actors have to figure out what they're going to do moving forward, whether they provide the data back or not if the ransom's paid, because they want to incentivize payment. That's what they're trying to get. They're trying to get money out of it at the end of the day.
Yeah.
They don't really care about your data necessarily. They want to make money, whether they sell it to someone else or they get ransom from you. But we are seeing this increased threshold of attacks, and especially groups being targeted that you wouldn't necessarily expect. I mean, I wouldn't expect that a K through 12 school system is going to be necessarily targeted like you would a utilities or energy company or government entity or healthcare entity. K through 12 just seems, why? But at the same time, you recognize there is value in data, and especially if you can get vulnerable data, you're going to try to exfiltrate that. So what's my biggest takeaway on the LA school thing is that they were in the midst of rolling out multi-factor authentication. Now, in this day and age, I expect most to have that, right? But many organizations still don't. It just hasn't been set up. And that's a concern. I mean, from a compliance standpoint, from a cybersecurity insurance standpoint, you have to have multi-factor. It's kind of table stakes these days. And if you have a single username password and you're able to get into the system, that's a real concern.
Yeah. Interesting. Do you think that, I mean, you mentioned before, like school districts are a target, like why not utilities, why not other industries? Do you think that it's somewhat has to do with funding, and that our educational system in general doesn't have the same funding as government entities and or larger firms, utilities, et cetera, et cetera. So because they have less money, does that mean that they have less to put into cybersecurity controls and other things that protect their environment? Does that then make them a target for cybersecurity attacks?
It certainly can. I mean, if you put yourself in the hacker's shoes, what do they really care about? It's the most valuable data. Like, what can I get the most amount of money from? And is that data valuable? I mean, if I can get into a private or public company's intellectual property and exfiltrate that, that is worth gold. Getting into a school system's confidential records, how valuable is that really? But at the same point, if they're not protected well enough and they're low-hanging fruit, you might as well go for it. So I think that's one area that hackers might look at in terms of what value does that data that I can get access to bring me monetarily. Now, from a protection standpoint, like you're asking of, does a school system have the same resources that a public or private company might? A lot of that has to do with government funding and E-rate programs and ensuring that we are putting money behind infrastructure where it's needed. And we've seen a change in that over the past few years. There's a lot more cybersecurity programs being funded, and you see that through E-rate programs. However, it's not always comprehensive to cover the entire system. I think the other challenge that we sometimes see in schools is how do you define a protected user in that install base? For example, I have my teachers and my back-end staff that's required. They're obviously a knowledge worker, right?
Yeah.
I protect them. But all my end users, I mean, I typically am skiing a scale of anywhere from 5 to 1 to 10 to 1 in terms of users to actual employee. So at Cisco, we have a method in some of our security programs to protect EDU environments at a discounted rate to protect those end users. The challenge, though, is sometimes they don't map to all the security function that I want or need. Other vendors don't offer that kind of discount structure. And that then leads it to being a more expensive venture to protect all these students when, in fact, I need to protect all of them. But at that scale, it becomes too expensive. So there's those typical challenges we see at school systems that wouldn't be necessarily relevant in other industries.
Yeah. I'd be curious, with you mentioned, the data, so on and so forth. And, one thing I think with some of the talk tracks that I have and from real world experience, we talk about, what's the value of data? And there's use cases where you never thought that, a specific industry, manufacturing or something, and it's not credit card information, it's not social security numbers, as things that you typically think that have value to it if you were to sell it on the dark web. It's, and one thing I've learned is asking the question is how much is your data worth to you, regardless of what that data is? Like, what are you willing to pay for your own data? And again, with the LA school district, I have no idea what it was, and what was compromised, or and again, username, password, what they have access to. And I tend to think about, like, okay, well, what's important? Like, okay, they might have social security numbers of the students, right? There might be some financial information, bank account numbers or something, if you were to pay, maybe credit card information. And I can see there's value there. But I think part of it is understanding that data, the value of data is what someone is willing to pay for it. Right. And just because you don't think your data is worth anything, ask yourself the question, what are you willing to pay for your own data, for your own information, right? So,
well, and to your point of manufacturing, I mean, you consider their environments. They might not give a crap if their email is down for half a day. But you take down production for 10 minutes and you're setting off all kinds of alarms, right? Yeah. And so it all depends on what's going to run the business. And it then comes down to profiling risk. What type of risk is that business willing to take on? And what's most critical from an asset and infrastructure perspective for their success? From a hacker perspective, they're going to look at exactly that to target what has the most impact so that they can deliver the most pain and therefore usually get the most amount of monetary resources. Now, unfortunately, you also have bad actors with nation states that aren't looking for it from a money standpoint. They're simply looking to create the most destruction. Yeah. And you see that specifically with utility systems and what they're typically targeting there. That's a scary environment, right? And so I have the utmost respect to our teams that are protecting both the U.S. infrastructure as well as global infrastructure from a utility perspective. Because, man, you get into that, you cause some real damage.
Yeah, and there's so many use cases and stories and different things that we focus on as an organization, and honestly, it's quite impressive, right? And I love to say that. Obviously, security is key regardless of where you are and so on and so forth. That's very important. But man, like you said, kudos to those folks that protect those environments day in and day out. Like, I couldn't do it. I think my stress level would be way too high, and that Sip Security would be a daily podcast.
Oh boy, yeah, right. Hopefully, you're not recording yourself with that stress.
No, exactly, right, exactly. No, that's great. So I think one of the other things that I noticed, like, cybersecurity risk is one of the top trends in 2022. Or I'm sorry, cybersecurity risk is the biggest threat to organizations in 2022. And Gartner recently released their cybersecurity trends for 2022. And there's 7 key things, right? You know, your distributed landscape, so on and so forth. It's actually a pretty decent read. And again, when we have the ability to digest and sit back and like understand all this data that's out there, you know, Gartner is obviously one of those trusted sources. The last one on it was the title of the trend was Beyond Awareness. And when you read the details, it pretty much states that the normal methods of educating our user base on cybersecurity isn't effective. So we need to look at, you know, beyond awareness is we need to look at other avenues to train and educate our employees on the potential risks and the new risks regarding cybersecurity. So what's your take on that, Dave?
Yeah, well, first and foremost, as we get to a new topic, I got to do a new pour. I don't know. Maybe you gave yourself a big pour, you just got to catch up. But I'm on to the next one here. So, um, with that said, I do think, you know, from an awareness side, we always have to improve. And a lot of it has to do with company culture and defining what our cybersecurity practices are at each one of these organizations. Um, if you look at a top level initiative of zero trust, which I think it's 75% or no, what was the latest stat? Like 90 something percent of CISOs are planning to implement zero trust or already have in this fiscal year. You have to define that at a principles and strategy level before you can get down to capabilities and features. I mean, it's just unequivocally, if you look at things at a enforcement point down as here's my technology and that's all I'm thinking about, you've completely neglected what you're doing around policy and procedure as well as end user education. That is so critical to ensuring that your employees feel safe and comfortable about reporting cybersecurity or risky behavior, that they feel comfortable emailing or pinging somebody or opening a ticket, or even know that they can. I mean, so many times they don't even know that that type of infrastructure exists. And I think sometimes our cybersecurity teams, that the customers we talk about, are thinking about, I just got to protect outside threats, that they're not considering one of the biggest threats out there, which is the insider threat, and ensuring that those users are protected. Now, we can do things like, you know, automated phishing threat attacks for education, and see once a month we test them out and see, you know, right? We've all fallen for that here at Cisco too. We run those quite a bit. We even include this as part of a product offer through Duo. We'll have automated phishing attack, and you can set up those, as well as third parties run that stuff too. So there's infrastructure out there where you can run that type of stuff. But just things like quarterly trainings, yearly training that's mandatory to the entire company around it is key. But there's another thing to think about here as well. We can only do so much around end user awareness. At the end of the day, these hackers, these social engineers, they're always going to evolve to become smarter, to be able to get past whatever gate we have. And they make this stuff look really legit nowadays. I mean, there's times I look at an email like, I really don't know if this is like ours or theirs or what.
I'd click on it. Yeah.
I'll have to go into our security tool and run a posture exam on it and look at the domain it's coming from. Like, they're getting pretty legit with it. So we also have to have our tools evolving as well. And a great example of this is what happened recently here at Cisco. And I'm sure you all saw in the announcements or in the news that Cisco got hacked. Now, we were able to immediately determine that we were under threat and attack, and able to quarantine that threat. Quite honestly, we didn't lose any kind of sensitive data. Nothing really malicious occurred necessarily. But what they were able to do is they were able to exhaust an end user with multi-factor authentication challenges. So the malicious attacker knew the username and password, and they were able to constantly keep trying to log in to this application, and they got push fatigue, which sounds like a weird term.
It's
kind of
essentially
what we're calling it, right?
Yeah.
It was Duo push fatigue. It was, God, this thing just keeps challenging me. I don't understand it. And they, instead of declining, they finally hit accept. And at that point, they won. It was by brute force. It was like denial of service, just this frustration of stop sending me this notification on my phone. And finally, I'll hit accept. Well, that's a social engineering construct in a way. And so the bad actor was able to get in. They took some screenshots of some internal information, but we saw on the back end all these denies and all these push requests. What ended up happening is an org-wide ask to 70,000 people to change their password overnight.
Yeah.
And then we forced that password change. We basically said we want to make sure that no one else's credential is out there. What we also added into Duo was we said, now we're going to have this 4-digit code on the front end of that push, so you can verify that when you send an authentication request and you're challenged by Duo, we can prove that it's coming from your authentication request and not someone else. And we also added in the ability to say, all right, after 3 or 4 failed attempts, not only do you have to accept the push, but you also have to enter in a 6-digit code that's only present on the Duo app that end user has. So even if someone has your primary authentication and is spamming the crap out of you with Duo pushes, we still can't get in unless they have that physical code on your app. That was us very quickly adjusting to the cybersecurity threat that was existing. Yeah. We knew we had to still create awareness. There was an email campaign that went out to all users. We asked to change the password. We said, hey, there's an event going on, be careful. But we also adapted the technology. And I think that's something that we have to keep in mind. There's only so much you can do around awareness. Agreed. You also have to continually monitor and modernize your security infrastructure to these continuously evolving threats. So it's a two-way street, right? Awareness is one big part, but also making sure that you're keeping up to date with your capabilities is just as big.
Yeah. And I will say, like, when all that was happening internally, I think our team space was like kind of blowing up. Like, hey, is this real? And I think it goes to show, like, hey, something's not normal. Like, we're getting these requests. Is this a real threat? Right? And it was before, like, I think it was before some other additional details came out of like the potential threats, so on and so forth. And I think our team's room, us being security minded individuals, right, in a technology company, like, hey, did anyone else get this request? Like, is this legit? And then it's like, oh yeah, we validate this is real. We need to do this. And I think to your point, Dave, you add in the additional capabilities. I noticed the little 4-digit code there, and I honestly I started paying attention to it more. It's like, yes, this is me. And there was a point, I think maybe last week or 2 weeks ago or something irrelevant, but my computer, I needed to restart, and one of the apps, like one of my web-based applications, relaunched after I reboot, and it authenticated, it pushed it to me. Now, I'll be honest, I wasn't in front of my computer at the time. I was out walking the dog, and and again, I reset the computer. I'm like, hey, I'm gonna go walk the dog. I come back, but halfway through my walk, I get this request on Duo on my device, and I notice a 4-digit code, and I'm like, I didn't do this. Right? And it could have been something that's like, I thought that I reset my computer, and things were loading. I could have just simply pushed, allow and go on my merry way. Yeah. But it goes, and again, it's that mindset of like, you can only go so far with awareness. And I think one thing we're seeing is like these threats are coming in all different manners. Who would have thought that? What'd you call it? The consistent, spamming. What is that called again?
Oh gosh, I don't even remember what I called it. I think the bourbon's catching up to me. I don't know.
But it's like the annoyance, right? Of like, I'm gonna ping you,
it's
like
fatigue
boom, boom, boom.
at the end of the day, right?
Yeah.
And you just get tired of it. You're like, fine, just accept. I don't know what's going on.
And there's similar cases where the hacker, and I don't remember, and maybe this was Uber, and I'm not trying to switch subjects here, but it was I'm requesting boom, 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 request on your device, and then that hacker calls like, hey, this is so and so from support. We have this issue. Go ahead and click yes on it.
It's all that social engineering, right?
It's all that social engineering, right?
Now, the problem at Uber was lack of segmentation. And this is where we get into, you can't be reliant on one single security initiative. There's no silver or golden bullet here to solve it. And there's a couple people that I follow, a few CISOs, podcasters, and they hate on MFA. And it's not because they say it doesn't work, it's just it's not foolproof, right? You can get around it with social engineering. There are methodologies that are out there today where we, unfortunately, the selling motion around MFA has almost been overplayed, where it's like you have to have this, and once you have it, you're good. And the LA schools is a great example of that. Their response to saying we're seeing increased threat activity, we've got this MFA push that's going to be launched. I think it was September 12th. And they're like, it's going to be installed by
Missed it, yeah.
and then we'll be safe. And it's like, no, don't say that. Like, you'll be safer. You'll definitely be in a better place than where you were. But that's not it. Like, that can still get compromised. And so we have to have a holistic approach to cybersecurity and zero trust across it all. You have to be thinking about it in multiple enforcement points. It can't be one single place. And that's, I think, the biggest challenge that we face sometimes is when our customers look at a single product and they're like, this is going to solve these problems. Yeah, it'll solve some of them, but it's not going to be able to say it got everything taken care of and you don't have to worry about it, right? There will always be a new workaround. There's always going to be new vulnerability. We have to have a defense in depth type approach. And unfortunately, that's not an easy button.
Yeah.
Right.
That's
and
the challenge.
I think a lot of companies want that easy button, and that is not that easy button. But there is a framework that we can leverage that will address the gaps that you have and look at a modern day approach to cybersecurity in a holistic viewpoint. That's what should be leveraged. And that's what makes it easier, right? It's not about just buy a product, install it, and I'm done, right? That would be nice, but that just doesn't exist. However, you don't need to take this crazy multi-vendor approach of 10 different products from all these different people and different licensing and support, and it's a freaking headache. There is a framework we can leverage that can identify those different gaps and challenges where we look at your different business flows, identify the challenges that you're facing in them today, where you are on the maturity model, and try to help you get up to a modern day cybersecurity stack so that if one aspect's compromised or gets bypassed, you have 4 or 5 different enforcement points along the way that stops that malicious activity before it becomes a real problem.
Right. I love, again, the framework is key. And, coming from the operations side of the house, right, working in infrastructures, and then, going to a partner side, being able to resell solutions and coming up to the manufacturer. Like, if I go back to early on in my career, like, I didn't know what I didn't know. I didn't know about the potential threats. I didn't know about the potential risks, the potential vulnerabilities within my infrastructure. I thought a firewall would protect everything from coming in, but that left everything else wide open, right? Again, multi-factor authentication, right? And so you mentioned frameworks, and obviously something that you taught me in recent time about why do we have frameworks? Well, it's to guide our consumers on the potential areas within their environment that may need to be protected.
Yeah.
And it's a framework, right? You don't have to implement everything, but what's important to you, right? What data is important? What applications important? What about the different actors within an environment? I have a contract user. Oh, what can they or should they be able to do versus an on-prem employee versus, so on and so forth. Like all those different personas that we have to deal with. And I love the concept of framework because, again, it makes it easier. It's not the end all be all, but it helps educate our customers on the potential areas that need to be secure. And again, every environment is different, right? And what's important, just, we talked about email may be important to one company, whereas it may not be important to the other. Like what's important varies.
Yeah, and it goes back to that risk conversation, right?
Yeah.
What's going on with the business? What's our risk? And then lay that into that framework. That's absolutely key. It's when you think of that phrase of you know what you know what you don't know, and then you don't know what you don't know, right?
Yeah.
And taking a framework like Zero Trust or SASE or hybrid work, any one of these helps you to define the I don't know what I don't know, and what is there that I need to be thinking of that I haven't been, and then aligns that to the risk profile that we've defined as a company. This is something that you and I are always helping our partners and our customers with, and I think that's the most important thing. Is you don't have to tackle it all at once, but let's make sure you're educated on where things are today from an IT infrastructure perspective and a security perspective, and then make sure that we align that to what the business is attempting to do, where they are today with their current infrastructure and their maturity around those capabilities, and then identify those gaps of where they want to go. And it helps to uncover those things that they may not be aware of. That's what's most important.
Exactly. And tying it back to the budget that organizations have, right? Because it's, although we would love to see unlimited budgets, right? And
Yeah.
we can spend all the money on security, that's not reality, right? I think that's the challenge is, we don't have unlimited money, right? No organization out there. There may be some that have unlimited money or more money than others, but we have
Well,
to be
wait till
able
they
to
get
balance.
hacked and have a
Yeah.
$4 million ransomware, and there's a lot of money.
Yeah.
But
Yeah. So it's a crazy ecosystem when we talk about security. And I honestly think that we've highlighted a couple with with Gartner, with LA schools and so on and so forth. So I think it's I think it's a relevant topic that will continue on. So
but cheers to that. Looking forward to many more of these. And I'll have to continue drinking on this bourbon.
we'll do that. So with all that being said and done, we thank you for your time today. And we look forward and having you tune into the next one. So stay tuned for that one. So cheers. Enjoy.
Cheers. Take care.